Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar for today, which is meeting whole grain requirements in school meals. To meet the criteria for grains in the National School Lunch Program and in the School Breakfast Program, the food item must be whole grain rich, and the food item must meet the ounce equivalent requirements for the grains component. All grain products must be either 100% whole grain, or it has to be a blend of whole grain meal or flour and enriched meal or flour that is at least 50% whole grain. The remaining amount of grain has to be enriched and must meet the FDA standards of identity for enrichment. As you can see from this chart, this is just a list of common whole grains that you may find on a food label. All of these grains meet the FDA standards of identity for whole grains that are used as ingredients. Reconstituted whole wheat can also be a whole grain, but you must request documentation from the milling company that they recombine the grain components to natural proportions of bran, germ, and endosperm. Other whole grain products do not have the word whole in their descriptions. Some examples are brown rice flour, wild rice, quinoa, millet, buckwheat, and sorghum. So we have to have acceptable documentation that our product is whole grain. So some acceptable documents are an ingredient declaration from the product container that shows that whole grain is the primary ingredient by weight. You could use a food label that shows the amount of whole grain in grams for the appropriate serving size. You can get a copy of a food label that displays one of the FDA whole grain health claims. Or you can use a USDA authorized CN label for entree items that include whole grains. So additional documents that could be used is a product formulation statement that's on the manufacturer's letterhead. You could also use a standardized recipe or a USDA foods fact sheet. This chart is a listing of grains that are not whole grains. Some of the grains that are listed on this chart are enriched and can be used in a product or a dish where the primary ingredient is whole grain rich. Pot or Scotch barley and pearl or pearl barley are not whole grains unless it also says whole barley or whole grain barley on the ingredient statement. If you're using stone ground, it must also contain the word whole in the ingredient statement. Any whole grain that's treated with lime or masa, which is often used in tortilla chips and taco shells, must have one of the FDA whole grain health claims on the packaging. Here are some non-creditable grains, and these grains don't contribute towards the meal pattern components. If purchased grain products include these ingredients, they must be present at a level of less than 2% of the product, or it has to be less than 0.25 ounce equivalent. That is equal to 3.99 grams for Exhibit A, groups A through G, or 6.99 grams for group H or I in order for the product to be creditable. This is an ingredient statement for white whole wheat breadsticks. As you can see, whole wheat flour is the first ingredient on the list. But the product also contains oat fiber, which is a non-creditable grain. So you would need a product formulation statement to determine if the weight of the non-creditable grain exceeds that 2%. If the statement is not on the ingredient label, the manufacturer would need to complete the product formulation statement. The form requires the manufacturer to complete the number of grams of non-creditable grain. And they must also certify that the non-creditable grain is not above the 0.24 ounce equivalent per portion. The product formulation statement for grains can be found at the link that's on this slide. The statement includes crediting standards based on grams of creditable grains and crediting standards based on revised Exhibit A, which is done in weights per ounce equivalent. So to determine if a product is whole grain, a whole grain per ounce equivalent has to be at least equal to 8 grams or more for group A through G on the Exhibit A chart. For groups H and I, whole grains must be the primary grains, with other grains being enriched. We can also determine if a product is whole grain rich if the product includes one of the FDA approved whole grain health claims on the packaging. And this slide shows the FDA approved statements that could be used. Diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease and certain cancers. Or it can say diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in saturated fat and cholesterol may help reduce the risk of heart disease. You can also use the ingredient list to determine if a product is whole grain. If the ingredient label lists a whole grain as the first ingredient, the product would be considered whole grain rich. The whole grain stamp is good information to suggest that the product contains the proper amount of whole grains, but manufacturers have been adding the stamp to products that are not whole grain rich. As you can see from this product that's on this slide, it says this is whole grain white bread, but the first ingredient on the ingredient label is actually enriched wheat flour and not whole grain wheat flour. When you have multiple grains in a product, it's harder to determine whether it meets the whole grain rich criteria. But when all whole grains are combined, they have to be the primary ingredient by weight. You see from this one, this product label, this cereal contains numerous whole grains. And water can actually be listed as the first ingredient in a product, but the second ingredient must be a creditable whole grain. So it must be listed as the first ingredient after water. If you're using a recipe, the weight of the grain ingredients is used to determine whether the weight of the whole grains is greater than or equal to the weight of grains that are not whole grains. So if you look at this recipe for cornbread, it has 3 different grains. 50 servings of this cornbread calls for 1/2 pound of whole wheat flour, a pound of whole grain cornmeal for a total of 1.5 pounds. It also calls for a pound of enriched bleached flour. The total pounds of the whole grains, though, is greater than the total pounds of the non-whole grain. So this recipe qualifies as a whole grain product. So in this recipe for an apple crisp, the weight of the grain ingredient is used to determine whether the weight of whole grain is greater than or equal to the weight of the grain that's not whole grain. So this recipe has 4 ounces of whole wheat flour, 9 ounces of enriched flour, but it also contains 9 ounces of rolled oats, which is also a whole grain. So the combination of the whole wheat flour and the rolled oats is equal to 13 ounces and is greater than the 9 ounces of enriched white flour. So this product would be whole grain rich. When using ready-to-eat breakfast cereals, you must list a whole grain first in the ingredient list, and the cereal must be fortified. If you have a cereal that's 100% whole grain, it does not need to be fortified to meet the requirements. As many of you may remember, on April 13th of 2020, the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland found a procedural error with the promulgation of the 2018 final rule for child nutrition programs. This final rule was going to allow meal pattern flexibilities for whole grains. As a result, the flexibility to have 50% of the grains be whole grain can't be used. So during the 2021-22 school year, all grains must be whole grain rich. And then comes COVID. And as everyone knows, there are certainly some supply chain issues that have come up, and it's harder and harder to get product, and it's harder and harder to get whole grain products. So due to this public health crisis, USDA issued a number of waivers to assist SFAs in providing nutrition meals to school children. Waiver number 90 allows for specific meal pattern flexibilities, including the flexibility that all grains be whole grain rich. The SFA has to show a demonstrated need to utilize this waiver, and schools must seek to meet the meal pattern requirements to the greatest extent possible. So the SFA has to provide the state agency with necessary information and obtain state agency approval before using the waiver. If the SFA has non-whole grain products that are remaining in inventory, this would be adequate justification for utilizing the waiver. Also, inability to obtain the whole grain product is adequate justification. Of course, the SFA is also expected to adjust the menu if at all possible in order to meet the whole grain requirements. I hope you're all familiar with this. I just wanted to make sure that you keep a copy of the whole grain resource that USDA published. It's to be used for the National School Lunch and School Breakfast Program. And this resource can assist you in meeting the whole grain rich criteria. And it can be downloaded from the Child Nutrition Program website. Remember that planning desserts, that you are only allowed to have 2 ounce equivalents of grain-based desserts at lunch per school week. So make sure you take that into account in your menu planning. Schools may serve non-creditable grains as part of a reimbursable meal once the minimum requirements for grains are met. The example that I always use is grits. Not one kid in Louisiana is going to eat whole grain grits, but a lot of schools like to put grits on the menu. So you can use it as an extra, but you have to remember that you have to count it towards the weekly dietary specifications. You can add it as an extra and not count it towards your, and not have it count towards your grain, but it has to meet the dietary specifications. Remember, when looking at ounce equivalents, that an ounce equivalent does not necessarily equal 1 ounce. All breads and grains must be served in at least the minimum amount for each grade group. This chart can be used. This is Exhibit A, and it can be used to determine the ounce equivalent of any grain product. So let's look at this ingredient label for whole wheat pancakes. So using the chart, we're going to calculate how many ounce equivalents are in these pancakes. Pancakes are in Group C of the Exhibit A chart, and I put the little screenshot of Group C on the slide. My pancakes weigh 97 grams. So how many ounce equivalents are in these pancakes? So we're going to take the 97 grams and divide it by 34, because in Group C, that's how many grams it takes to equal an ounce equivalent. So 34 divided 97 divided by 34 is going to equal 2.85. But remember, we have to round down to the quarter ounce. So we're going to round it down to 2.75 ounce equivalents. This product formulation statement for bread states that one serving is 1.96 ounces. So using Exhibit A, a 1 ounce equivalent of bread is equal to 28 grams or 1 ounce. So how many ounce equivalents are in this 1.96 ounce piece of bread? It's a pretty large piece of bread. So in this case, an ounce actually does equal an ounce equivalent. So there are 1.96 ounce equivalents in this bread. But remember, we have to round down to the nearest quarter ounce. So the bread using the grain chart would be equal to 1.75 ounce equivalents. Now I'm going to take that same Ultra Loco bread. We can also calculate the ounce equivalents based on the total weight of the creditable product, the grain itself. So 16 grams of creditable grain is required to equal 1 ounce equivalent for groups A through G when using Exhibit A. And you can find this information at the bottom of Exhibit A. So this bread contains 16.5 grams of whole white wheat flour and 15.7 grams of enriched wheat flour for a total of 32.2 grams, or it equals to 2 ounces. So using this method, the weight of the grain, the bread's going to count as 2 ounce equivalent. Now, note that in this example, the crediting by weight provided 2 ounce equivalents, as opposed to using Exhibit A, it credited as 1.75 ounce equivalents. Either way you want to do it is acceptable. You can do it by the weight of the grain, or you can do it by using Exhibit A. If you're using a product formulation statement for documenting grains in school meals, make sure to include a copy of the label from the product as well. The product formulation statement does have to be on company letterhead, has to be signed by an official company representative. There is a product formulation statement that is used when crediting based on the grams of creditable grains. And there's another one for using when you're crediting based on the revised Exhibit A, using weights per ounce equivalent. Ounce equivalents can also be determined by using the weight of grain in the recipe. This recipe for cornbread includes 2.5 pounds of total grains for 50 servings. So let's look at the grains. There's 1 pound or 16 ounces of enriched flour. I'm going to convert that to grams by multiplying 16 times 28.35. So the total grams of enriched flour is 453.60. We'll divide the number of servings in the recipe, and the result is the number of grams of enriched flour in each serving. And that is equal to 9.07. I'm going to do the same thing with whole grain cornmeal and whole wheat flour to determine the amount, the number of grams in the product of each of those grains. And so the total is 22.67. So I'm going to divide that 22.67 by 16. And so the product is 1.41 grams per serving. So if we round that down to the nearest quarter, it becomes 1.25 ounce equivalents of grain. Ounce equivalents for cold cereal can also be calculated by weight. For group I, 1 ounce of cereal is equal to 1 ounce equivalent. So these Honey Nut Cheerios weigh 1 ounce or 28 grams. So we know that that's equal to 1 ounce equivalent. It can also be calculated by volume. So using Exhibit A under group I, it says that 1 cup of cereal rounds equals 1 ounce equivalent. So if I'm using this method, how many ounce equivalents are in the cereal? It would be 0.75 ounce equivalents. So you see that if I'm calculating it based on weight, it equals 1 ounce equivalent, but on volume, it equals 0.75 ounce equivalents. Either way is acceptable. Okay, so that is the end of our presentation on whole grains. Does anyone have any questions? Let's just talk for just a minute about, because I've gotten numerous calls concerning difficulties in obtaining whole grain products. And so if you're needing to procure products outside of the normal procurement process, and you need assistance, please let us know. We will assist you in any way possible. We know that the supply chain is very strained, and it's very difficult to obtain some products. I know people are really fighting tooth and nail to get products in. So if you have any needs or any problems in that area, please let us know. We can assist you. Or you may have to, if you are unable to get some products, you may have to select the grain waiver. The grain waiver is going to be good until the end of December 2021, and we're going to reevaluate based on what the supply chain issues are as of January 1st to determine whether people still need that whole grain waiver. So, but if you have any questions, please feel free to call us, and we will be happy to assist you. So it doesn't look like we have any questions. If there are no questions, hang on, just. Does anyone want to review the way the items were calculated? Did everybody understand that? Use the chat feature and let us know if you understood the different ways that you can calculate the whole grains. We want to make sure that you have a good understanding. I'm being told to review the calculations again. Okay, so in looking at our pancakes, the label on my pancakes says that a serving is 97 grams for those 3 pancakes. So if I'm looking at Exhibit A and I look up pancakes, pancakes is listed under Group C. And the Exhibit A chart says 1 ounce equivalent is equal to 34 grams or 1.2 ounces. So I'm going to divide the 97 by 34, and I get 2.75 ounce equivalents. It's more than that, and I can't see the slide. So let me see. It would be equal to 2.85, but rounded down would equal 2.75 ounce equivalents. So my 3 pancakes are going to be 2.75 ounce equivalents of grain. So that would be adequate for 2 ounces for the 2 ounce requirement of grains, or the 1 ounce requirement of grains. Then on my bread with the funny name, the Ultra Loco bread, it's a big piece of bread, and the serving size is 1.96 ounces. So I'm going to use the Exhibit A chart, and bread is in Group A. And 1 ounce equivalent of bread is equal to 28 grams or 1 ounce and then it equals, you have to determine how many ounce equivalents are in 1.96 ounces of bread. So when I'm looking at the chart, there's 1.96 ounce equivalents in the bread, but it's rounded down to 1.75 ounce equivalents. So then if I'm looking at a product formulation statement for this Ultra Loco bread, I'm going to calculate the ounce equivalents based on the weight of the grain. So in this product, there is 16 grams of creditable grain is required to equal 1 ounce equivalent. But this bread contains 16.5 grams of whole white wheat flour and 15.7 grams of enriched wheat flour. So my total is 32.2 grams or 2 ounces. So if I'm going to use this method, the bread's going to count as 2 ounce equivalents. Now, if I go back to the parcel, yeah. If I'm crediting by the weight of the grain, it is going to credit differently than by the weight of the product. So remember, both are acceptable ways of determining that the ounce equivalents for grain. Then if we're using a recipe, we can use the weight of the grain in a recipe. And this particular recipe for cornbread includes 2.5 pounds of grain for 50 servings of cornbread. So that's where we have to, this one gets a little more complicated. So we're going to look at the total weight of each grain. We're going to take the number of pounds, convert it to ounces, multiply it by 28.35 because that's the number of grams in an ounce. We get our total grams, and then we're going to divide each one of those by 50, and that determines how many grams is in a serving of the cornbread, how many total grams of grain is in this cornbread, and it is equal to 1.41 grams, 1.41 ounce equivalents. So we're going to round that down, and it'll be 1.25 ounce equivalents. Okay, and the last one is the ounce equivalents for cereal. And we can do it one of two ways. If we're going to use Exhibit A, 1 ounce of cereal would equal 28 grams. And so it would equal 1 ounce equivalent. But we could also do it by volume. And 1 cup of cereal rounds is equal to 1 ounce equivalent. So this product is only 3/4 of a cup of cereal rounds. So it would equal 0.75 ounce equivalent. If I'm trying to meet the grain requirement for say K-8, and I only needed 1 ounce equivalent, I would want to use the grain from the Exhibit A, excuse me, from the Exhibit A chart for weight. So, okay. So again, if there's no questions, we're gonna end the training. Hope everyone has a good week, and enjoy the nice cool weather. Have a good day.